now we're pleased to continue our series of readings, spotlighting writers from the new second story anthology, Briefly Knocked Unconscious by a Low-Flying Duck. Closing out the first half of our program is a second story company member who also serves as its director of education. She has worked as a writer and actress in Chicago for 20 years, and her original solo shows, The Half-Life of Magic and Love Thy Neighbor Till It Hurts, have received multiple productions in the area. Please give a warm welcome to Julie Eady.
This is the book that was mentioned earlier, Briefly Knocked Unconscious by a Low-Flying Duck, and it's a collection of stories that have all premiered at Second Story, which is another reading series in town. And the title, Briefly Knocked Unconscious by a Low-Flying Duck, comes from the titular story, which is the first story in the book about SeaWorld. And it's about... the author worked at SeaWorld for a summer and was actually briefly knocked unconscious by a low-flying duck. But my story is called When the Fairies Came. I was 10 years old when my mother revealed to me that there wasn't a Santa Claus. We were lying on my parents' bed, and I remember running my finger along the wavy pattern stitched into the green velveteen bedspread over and over. Now, I'd asked my mom for the truth about Santa, badgered her, actually. But when she finally admitted it, it was a blow. Rather than feeling vindicated that my suspicions were correct, I felt a little betrayed, a little lied to. I remember her saying, "Oh, well, the spirit of Christmas is real, and that's what's important." But I just wondered why the whole world was in on a conspiracy to get kids to believe in a big fat man in a red suit that didn't exist. That's not what I was thinking about that June evening, though, as I sat with my neighbors, Jenny and Deb, on Jenny's front porch drinking really cold Pinot Grigio. I was thinking about my garden, as we sat watching our kids playing in the front yard, 8 of them between the 3 of us, but only 1 is mine, so it's all lopsided. Our husbands straggled out from time to time, joining us and then leaving us as they pleased. On this particular night, the older kids, the tweens and teenagers, were next door on my own front porch, whispering and then laughing too loudly, posing a little for each other, even though they've known each other since they were babies. The littler kids, my own 4-year-old and Jenny's 5-year-old, Selena, were playing with sidewalk chalk in their own signature style, which involved garden hoses, buckets of water, and lots of chalk that was then mixed into a paste to be applied thick and Van Gogh-like to the sidewalk. Jenny glanced over at her son on my porch. "I think Alex must have heard Michael and me having sex," she whispered, "because he sleeps with his door shut every night now." Deb responds, "Oh, there are all sorts of reasons an 11-year-old boy sleeps with his door shut, and they all have to do with sex." We laugh and drink, and I notice my hands on the wine glass, wrecked from an afternoon in the garden hacking away at plants that threaten to take over our entire yard. When we first moved into our house, I embraced gardening with more passion than skill, throwing everything I could lay my hands on into the ground. Now, 5 years later, the flower beds require constant pruning and dividing. It's a part-time job from May to October just to keep the vegetation at bay. "Mom, we need something to do." It's my daughter, Dorothy. She approaches the porch and kicks her filthy little foot against mine. "Well, why don't you write a note to Bart and Karen on their sidewalk?" I suggest. "No, we're tired of chalk," she whines. Selena joins her at the foot of the porch steps, her little brown belly smeared with pink chalk. "We want something to eat. We're hungry," she angles. "No," Jenny says. "No more snacks." "Look, why don't you take your dollies for a walk?" I suggest. "No," Dorothy says, irritated by our obtuseness. "They're sleeping." I look at her sweaty face and glassy eyes. It's obvious she's exhausted. The responsible thing to do would be to take her in, put her in a bath, and then into bed. But I don't want to. I want to stay here, chatting with my friends, admiring our children while they amuse themselves. Listen, I say. Summer solstice is in a few days when the fairies dance all night. Why don't you write them a note and invite them into our yards? Dorothy and Selina look to each other, eyes wide. Yeah, they say. They scramble up the stairs and into the house for paper and pens, which they bring out and fling in front of Jake and Katie, the two 8-year-olds. We need you to help us write notes to the fairies, they announce, and they splay themselves in the yard. An hour later, we pick up the yards and we head inside for the night, but not before I tack 2 notes to the fairies on the big tree that stands between the sidewalk and the street in front of our house. Dorothy's note is full of pleas for friendship, and Selina's is full of questions. Where do you live? How big are you? What do you eat? Later that night, before I go to bed, I scrounge up some paper. It looks woodlandy, with twigs and flower petals pressed into it, and disguising my handwriting by using my left hand, I compose a note from the fairies. Dear children, we eat flower nectar and berries from your gardens while you're sleeping. We spend our time dancing, making flowers grow, and enjoying all things that are beautiful. We love living in your yards because you are children who are very kind to each other. I tack the note to the big tree, taking the girls' letters, and I go to bed. The next morning, there is squealing and wonder as the girls rush from the tree in their nightgowns and present the note to me to read for them. That evening, the same front porch ritual unfolds, and this time the fairies leave the girls a little garden of translucent lollipops in the front flower bed, bedecked with ribbons and their names. That's when fairy fever really kicked in. Jake and Katie, the 8-year-olds, began writing notes at dusk as well. Now, they were too old to really believe in fairies, but they weren't stupid. It always makes more sense to participate in an enterprise that's supplying you with candy and ask the hard questions later. The kids demanded endless information from the fairies. Dear fairies, do you know the Tooth Fairy? Do you know Mary and Fred, the bullfrogs that disappeared from the Foster's Pond? Thank you for the candy, but could you please leave a magic wand, a real one? Can you turn little girls into fairies? Please take us to fairyland with you. We are very good dancers. I started to get a little more inventive with my late-night fairy notes. Dear children, yes, we know the Tooth Fairy, but she's very busy and travels a lot. We're afraid it's too risky to leave you a magic wand because the elves might come along and steal it. Yes, we know Mary and Fred. They are dear frog friends and lots of fun. Now, this last bit was a little tricky because all of the adults on the block would bet money that Noelle, the Foster's own bloodthirsty cat, had massacred those frogs. But, like the fact that your parents have sex, this was information those kids didn't really want. I spent my late evenings devising methods for the fairies to delight the girls, leaving tiny piles of fairy dust or a trail of pebbles leading to a basket of strawberries. At one point, Jenny, watching her kids discover their names spelled out in sticks in the backyard, offered vaguely, "Do you need any help with this?" But fairy work was so gratifying. I mean, look, no one can excel in every area of motherhood, but this I could do. Late one night, I found Dorothy, her forehead pressed against the screen and her window searching the yard below. "I can hear them, but I can't see them," she said. "Really?" I asked. "Well, what do they sound like?" "Oh, bells and whispering and stuff. Don't get near the window," she waved at me. "They won't come out if grown-ups are around. They just like kids." One night, around midnight, my husband Brad padded out onto the front porch to find me teetering atop a step stool in the wet grass, tying pink ribbons to the branches of an overgrown hydrangea. "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm decorating this tree." "No, really, what are you doing?" He sat down on the top step of the porch. Yeah, this fairy stuff seems a little out of hand. I mean, they really believe. Well, it's great they believe, I said. It's giving them an experience of magic. Yeah, but it's untrue, Julie, he says carefully. It's a lie. Well, it's not a lie. I mean, fairies don't exist, but magic does. That's what's important. He rested his head on the banister and looked at me, his dark eyes weighted with sleep. Look, I'm just saying that you're creating a situation where it's completely irrational for them not to believe in fairies, because everything around them supports the idea, as much as everything supports the idea of gravity. Honey, don't overthink it. I took my ribbon scissors and I began hacking away at the wild oregano under the tree. Jesus, this stuff grows so fast you can see it. It's taking over the yard. And then, as I heard Brad sigh and head inside, that's when I thought of my mother and me on the green bedspread talking about Santa. How the depth and scope of that discovery had called everything into question in my 10-year-old mind. And what if Brad was right? To discover the truth about fairies was to unravel something of magic in general, to untie a knot that won't hold anything together anymore. If fairies are a hoax, then there goes the tooth fairy. And if she's made up, why not the Easter Bunny, Santa, God, for that matter? I sat there on the step stool, the oregano bleeding perfume at my feet, realizing there's no way to unplant a seed once it's rooted and taken hold, unless you want to leave a gaping hole. The next day, after the ribbon tree had been celebrated and danced around, it became clear that another corner had been turned. I came home in the middle of the day to find Dorothy and Selena in their swimsuits on the front sidewalk screaming at the sky, "Fairies, we see you! Come down here!" As I got out of the car, Dorothy yelled, "Mom, look! The fairies are riding in the sky!" I looked up to see a skywriting plane high in the air, leaving an unintelligible trail of white smoke against the clear blue sky. Selena and Dorothy continued their hoarse screaming, their little bodies rigid with passion, the sprinkler running and forgotten in the front yard. I joined Brad, who was sitting on the porch swing watching them. "Did you tell them plane exhaust was fairy riding?" I asked. He shook his head. "What's it say, Mom? What does it say?" Dorothy demanded. I don't know, I shrugged helplessly. Over the next few days, Dorothy and Selena became obsessed with visiting Fairyland. Somehow they got the idea they could go at night in their sleep, and that if they drank enough of what they called special potion, limes squeezed into water, that they would start shrinking. Dorothy demanded to be measured several times a day, proclaiming, "I feel like I'm getting shorter, Mom, I really do." Then Selena announced that she had actually gone to Fairyland during the night. After that, they would no longer eat cantaloupe, because in Fairyland, it tasted like poop. The summer wore on. The blackberry bushes took over the lavender in the garden, and the notes to the fairies continued, but their tone changing a bit, becoming less plaintive and more demanding. "Why can't we see you? Where are you hiding? Will you leave us money?" I started not answering their notes sometimes, but that didn't slow the girls down. As Dorothy's 5th birthday approached at the end of August, she became obsessed with the fairies attending her party. Hyped up on magic, she wanted a magician to come and do a show in our backyard. The day of her birthday was beautiful, the cake covered in flowers, the magician a good sport, taking the time to show some of his tricks to Dorothy afterwards. That night, entering her room to tuck her in, I found her once again, forehead against the screen, searching the yard below. "Hey," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. She pulled away from the window and looked at me. "Did you have a nice party, honey?" "Mm-hmm." She reached out her finger and ran it across the screen. "Well, did you like the magician?" "Well, I wanted a real magician. One that could do the real magic, not just tricks. And the fairies didn't come. They never come. They never let us see them." Her brow furrowed over her heavy, tired eyes as her face filled with desperation. a longing that took me forward in time to when she'd be a teenager and would want a boy that she couldn't have, or when she'd be older than that, wanting all manner of things that people and fairies could not deliver. "Do you really think they're out there, Mom?" she asked. "What do you think?" I countered. "I don't know." A few days later, the fairies would leave a final note, wishing the kids on the block a good school year, bidding them goodbye as they fled the cool weather in a clumsy, unsatisfying exit. But that night, the night of Dorothy's birthday, we lay down together, my face buried in her hair that smelled vaguely of cake, listening to what we could almost hear through the window, the plants groaning over their borders in the garden, and the fairies packing their bags.